Hi, I'm going to be talking about primary versus secondary response. And both of those are characteristics of our adaptive immune response as opposed to our innate response. And specifically, I'm going to explain how our adaptive immune response has memory. What kind of memory am I talking about? Well, technically speaking, it's called immunologic memory. And what that is the ability of our immune system to respond much more quickly and with much greater efficiency the second time it is exposed to the same antigen. So what's pretty incredible is that our immune systems have evolved so much that they can adapt to nearly any foreign antigen presented to at the present, but what's even more amazing is that our immune systems can store this information and use it for a later time that will come in the future. And so that's kind of what I mean by memory. And so now I want to break it down to the two components of our adaptive immune response, the primary response and the secondary response. So what is the primary response? Well, the primary response is the adaptive immunity undergone the very first encounter with a foreign antigen. And what cells are involved in this response? Well, the naive B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes. And I say naive because this is their very first exposure to the antigen, not their second. And so here, these key lymphocytes with their receptors that are specific for those antigens are going to be selected, activated, and sent out to destroy and wipe out that pathogen. And even more specifically, activated T helper cells are going to help activate B cells, and clonal expansion of both types of lymphocytes, B cells and T cells, are going to occur. And at the very end, this is going to result in having many T and B cells that are specific for that certain antigen, and those B cells are actually going to release antibodies that will then go attach to that antigen and direct its destruction. And the whole time, these lymphocytes will be incorporating messages they received from that innate immune system. And one other thing I wanted to point out is that your primary response appears mainly in your lymph nodes and your spleen. So now what happens if that same antigen or pathogen comes back a second time around? Well, that's when your secondary response comes into play. So what cells are at work in our secondary response? Well, secondary response involves something called memory cells. And these memory cells are actually coming from the final and more efficient B and T lymphocytes that are initially utilized in the primary response. They're basically being called back into battle to fight the same enemy. But the difference now is they're going to be able to respond at a much quicker rate and with much more efficiency than they did in that primary response. And these memory cells are actually going to continue to learn and improve their eradication strategies during each subsequent encounter with the very same antigen. And they are so effective that the second time around, when that same pathogen affects the body, normally there are no symptoms experienced because that secondary immune response is so powerful and so quick. And depending on the specific antigen, many memory cells can actually remain in your body for decades. And it's this incredible memory property that we get from our secondary response that actually prevents us from catching diseases a second time. And so now I just want to show you two figures that I thought were really awesome. Here you'll see our primary versus our secondary response. And you'll notice our primary response has a much larger lag phase than our secondary response. And this is simply because our primary response is just slower, and that secondary response due to those memory cells is so much quicker that it's just not going to have near the amount of lag phase as that first primary response. It's actually going to have negligible lag phase, honestly. And this is a graph of time versus antibodies, and if you'll see in the secondary response, because it's so much more powerful, there's such an increased number of antibodies produced as opposed to that primary response. And what I want to show you over here, this is just another kind of more detailed graphical representation of it. This has our primary response, or the short little humps, and our secondary response are the long ones. And just some important facts I want to point out in this. It kind of gives a more detailed breakdown by days versus our blood antibody level. So in that primary response, the lag phase is often longer, about 4 to 7 days. And in that secondary response, that lag phase is much shorter, about 1 to 4 days. Another thing I want to point out are the antibody levels. In that primary response, the level of antibodies reaches its peak in 7 to 10 days. However, in the secondary response, the level of antibody reaches its peak in 3 to 5 days. It's just that much more quicker. In your primary response, your antibody level declines rapidly, and your affinity of antibodies is so much lower for its antigen. But if we look at that secondary response, you can see this huge peak and just see that the antibody level remains high for a longer period, and those antibodies are going to have a much, much greater affinity for the antigen. And another thing I want to point out, if you'll notice it says IgG here and IgM, and those actually weren't in the textbook, so I had to do a bit of research on those. And these are just antibodies referring to proteins that bind to antigens in specific cases. And they're actually both classes of immunoglobulins. And the IgM are just your antibodies that were referred to or that are utilized in the first initial exposure to an antigen. And that's why you can see the IgM is prevalent in this primary response. And IgG are technically those conferring immunity because they're involved in the secondary response. And so just an example is to say if your child got chickenpox and he went and got his blood tested while he had it, he would have an elevated result of IgM in his blood because that's initially following the exposure. But then if you wait a while, he's going to acquire a long-term immunity for it. And where's that immunity coming from? It's coming from this development of these IgG antibodies. And if you look at his blood work at a later time, you would see had elevated of those. And so what's cool is that IgMs are temporary and they disappear within 2 or 3 weeks, but these IgGs will stay in your body for quite a long time after they replace the IgMs. And so that's just a cool graphical representation of that. And now I just wanted to talk a little about how we can apply this to our everyday lives. And the best way I can think about that is considering vaccines. So basically vaccines are kind of taking advantage of this whole immunological memory idea that our B and T lymphocytes have in the secondary response. Because basically a vaccination is taking a weakened or dead pathogen and placing it into our healthy immune systems and basically trying to get them to educate and prepare the immune system for a secondary later attack by the same pathogen, which is basically our primary and secondary response. The secondary response already has information about an antigen, and that's why its response is so much quicker and so much more efficient because it already has memory on that. So basically what a vaccine is trying to do. And something else that's really cool, I thought, is that some antigens take multiple rounds of exposure to that antigen in order for us to acquire immunity. And in these sorts of pathogens, that you actually require the use of something called a vaccine booster shot, which is basically just multiple exposures to the antigens because each new round you're trying to drive a stronger secondary response and adapting it and just trying to refine and fine-tune that lymphocyte population to make it quicker and stronger and just better and more efficient to when that harmful pathogen comes by in the near future, it'll be able to attack it and create an effective immune response. So yeah, that's just an example of how vaccines and secondary responses are related, and that's primary versus secondary response. Thanks.